Hey everybody, welcome to this week's Chamber Beat. I'm Ryan King with the Chamber, and as we do every week, this beat is sponsored by LBMC and Baker Donaldson. Chairman, it's a special week. We got our appropriations amendment, and we have a special guest with us, Chairman of the Finance, Ways and Means Committee in the Senate, Senator Bo Watson. Welcome.
Thank you.
Chairman.
Great to be here. Yeah, wonderful.
So, you guys have a long standing history of responsible, conservative, philosophical approach to the budget. Tell us a little bit about that and really how this year specifically embodies that.
Well, in Tennessee, we have to pass a balanced budget, so we can never spend more than we take in. And Tennessee is really a lower middle class state, so I try to look at the budget from the perspective of the way a family would look at their budget. I always tell people back home, we don't drive Porsches and Mercedes, we drive Fords and Chevys, but they get us to the same spot. The state's philosophy has always been to only spend what's necessary to operate government and no more. And we are in somewhat of a struggle this year with our budget because the federal revenues have been so high due to all the different Recovery Act dollars that it has inflated the amount of money that we've had in our budget and made us really work at being really disciplined about how we spend the money that we have.
Good. So we'll see lots of non-recurring expenditures out of this budget, maybe disproportionately more than previous years.
Right, and to folks who aren't familiar with budget talk, non-recurring is money that you spend only one time. So in our budget system, we have money that we expect to spend every year moving forward, and then money that we expect to spend one time. The analogy I give back home is, if you buy something that you're then going to throw away, that's a one-time expenditure. But if you buy something that you're going to use for years and years and years, that's a recurring expenditure. So yes, we have a lot of one-time money, which will allow us to do a lot of building projects around the state, which is really good for the economy. It's really good for communities. It has people being hired, and it makes employment good. But it also creates sort of a spike in activity because once that activity is over, it doesn't continue on. And so trying to figure out how you smooth that out over time so that all communities in Tennessee benefit over years instead of just for a brief period of time is part of the budgeting tricks.
Chairman, you do a really good job of breaking down the budget process in a way that somebody like me can understand. What can we expect to see over the next 2 to 3 to 4 weeks from now until the budget is actually passed and signed into law?
Right. So the way our system in Tennessee works, the governor has to give us his original budget proposal by the 1st of February. So we saw that, and he was on time. Not every governor has always been on time, but the last 2 governors have been right on time in terms of giving us their initial budget proposal. And then, as session progresses, the governor makes some amendments or some changes to his or her budget, and they bring us that amendment or those changes. Now, what people often don't realize is that the governor can only propose what he wants the state to spend its money on. It is really up to the House and the Senate to decide what we ultimately spend our money on. So we are now in the stage where we've got the governor's original budget, we've got the governor's proposed amendment to the budget, and now the legislature is looking at all the things the governor thinks we ought to be doing and comparing it to what all the things the different members of the legislature, all 132 of them, believe we need to be doing. And then over the next 3 or 4 weeks, it is the Finance Committee's responsibilities, both in the House and the Senate, to bring all those groups together to form the document that we will eventually pass that funds all the activities that the state of Tennessee is involved in next year.
And you have to pass it by Constitution, right?
We have no choice.
It's the only law that you're required to pass.
It is the only law. It is the most important bill that we have here because it is the only one that we are actually required to pass. And that makes those of us that serve on the finance committees in the House and the Senate an extra layer of responsibility because, if you look at a state's budget document, it actually reveals what the values of the state are. It reveals what the state's dreams and hopes are. And so those of us that have the incredible responsibility and honor of working on that document get to kind of see laid out before us where Tennessee is going over the next year, and in many instances where Tennessee is going over the next 20 or 30 years. You take, for example, an investment like out in West Tennessee, right, where we we are on the front edge of creating a completely new part to Tennessee. It's virtually undeveloped, and a generation from now, people are going to see a community out there that didn't exist in our lifetime, and now all of a sudden people will go, well, where did all this come from? Well, we have the awesome opportunity to be working on the front end of that, and that's really cool stuff. And that happens over and over all across the state when we're working on budget stuff. We get to see, in numbers, we get to see these different things happening in the state. That's what makes us such a great state.
And you point out it's really cool in the moment to know that you're making history in the moment. You guys get to do that in finance. Last question, Chairman. So some of maybe the highlights of this budget. What are 2, 3, 4 maybe highlights of the proposed budget that you would point out?
Well, as we sit here today, I'll tell you what they are, but the way the budget process goes, if you come back and we talk next week, it might be a little bit different. But obviously when the governor first presented his first budget, there were probably 2 really huge highlights. One was that we were going to be doing an $800 million project out in West Tennessee. Even though we took that up in special session, it's rolled into this discussion. The second is the state is reforming how we fund K-12 education. And a constitutional requirement is that we fund public education. And it's the largest single contribution to K-12 education that we've ever made. It's $1 billion. And that's a huge amount of money for a state like Tennessee. And so we're in a discussion about how that's going to work. That still hasn't been decided. But there's $1 billion of budget for that. And then, recently you had the Titans come up and say, hey, we need a new stadium, which created the need to look at authorizing, $500 million worth of bonds. That's still a lot of debate to go on about that, but those are highlights that come up. And then lastly, it's reflected in the budget document, but unless you're really into this game, you don't really see it, and that's all of the Federal Recovery Act money that's coming in. Our budget went from $42 billion last year to $52 billion this year. It's a $10 billion increase. We've never seen anything like that in the history of the state. But a lot of that's those federal dollars. And so there are things happening that are highlights in each community that you're not really seeing in the budget, but they're actually there for those of us that look at particularly the federal numbers. But K-12 education, it is a top priority in this state. And so I would say of all the highlights, that's the biggest one. That's a generational change for many of us to participate in, so it's a really big deal.
Well, thank you, Chairman, for the emphasis on education, but also workforce, because we know there is a significant amount of priority being placed on that, as you said, in the budget.
Right. Well, again, if you want to know what a state's all about and what their values are, you can look at their budget. Where you put your treasure is where your heart is. And so if you looked at ours, you would see that we spend a lot on education, particularly preparatory education like K-12. We're investing more and more in career and technical education. You'll see that reflected in the budget. And we're investing a lot in workforce development and economic development. And so we are truly trying to invest back in our citizens.
Well, again, Chairman, thank you so much
welcome.
for your time this afternoon. That's all we've got for this week's Chamber Beat.